The first assassination attempt of a president or former president in more than 40 years, shaking a nation to its core, leading to calls from both sides to bring the country together. But now strong doubts about whether that appeal will last and whether Donald Trump's defiant response after nearly losing his life will boost his campaign.
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. A presidential race like no other dips further into the improbable, the survival of a presidential candidate by just millimeters. The selection of 39-year-old Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as Donald Trump's running mate and an energized Republican base vowing party unity. On the Democratic side, as doubts persist, President Biden is holding a steady round of public events to prove he is, in fact, fit to run for re-election. Well, what happens now? Tonight, you will hear from Democratic analyst Abou Amara and Republican analyst Amy Koch. Also, Humphrey School professor Larry Jacobs, as well as constitutional law professor and political analyst David Schultz, who will also tell us about that overshadowed major headline, the dismissal of the classified documents case against Donald Trump. Let's start with Professor Jacobs. Well, joining us right now is Professor Larry Jacobs from the Humphrey School. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be with you.
All right, your reaction to these extraordinary events.
In years from now, we're going to talk about what has been happening the last few days. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump is extraordinary. The ongoing civil war in the Democratic Party over Joe Biden's candidacy continues and may be heading into another set of conflicts and crises. So this has just been an extraordinary period.
Is it something that you think will galvanize people around President Trump? Does this help President Trump, as bizarre as that sounds, an assassination attempt?
You know, I think there will be certainly a short-term mobilizing around Donald Trump. I think most of the country is relieved and thankful that he is fine. And I think the enthusiasm that we're seeing at the Republican convention in Milwaukee is terrific TV. It's a focusing event of unparalleled power. Whether that lasts over 3 or 4 months of a campaign, that's an open question.
Well, there's a long way to go. I mean, obviously, as we've seen, a lot can happen in a very short period of time. Your thoughts on the selection of J.D. Vance, who is on camera saying all kinds of things about the former president, including that he was a Hitler, that he didn't support him. That was back in 2016.
But J.D. Vance and Donald Trump certainly had a rocky beginning, and some of the most searing public criticisms of Trump come from J.D. Vance. On the other hand, they've been coming very close over the last 2 to 3 years, and Donald Trump campaigned hard for Vance last year, helping Vance to win the nomination and then the election in the state of Ohio to United States Senate. So I don't think there's a rift there at all. I think Vance brings quite a bit to the Trump ticket. They share a kind of economic populism. They share a social conservative orientation. And I think the fact that Vance is 39 years old, it brings a kind of vibrancy that neither Joe Biden or Donald Trump have, is a plus.
Right. Although poll after poll going over years and years has shown that the vice presidential candidates do not matter. People vote for the person at the top of the ticket. But you have 2 candidates who are the oldest in American history. Will the VP candidates matter more this time around?
I don't think it's going to matter in terms of the general election, but it could matter in terms of small numbers of voters of closely contested states. We're looking at possibly, a close election here, though we'll see if the Democrats can get their act together. If it's a close election, J.D. Vance could be a big help there. But I think also Donald Trump is putting a marker down for the future of the Republican Party. Vance is going to be a player for decades now, and he's clearly been kind of branded as Donald Trump's successor.
In terms of the polling in Minnesota, do you think Minnesota is a swing state now? We haven't gone for a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate since 1972 and Richard Nixon.
I think Minnesota is very much in play. You've got Donald Trump putting money and campaign resources into Minnesota. The polls show it to be, a toss-up election, and we are also seeing some troubling signs for Democrats in terms of turning out the loyal Democratic supporters. We saw almost 46,000 uh, primary voters for the Democrats who cast a ballot for uncommitted because they had so many doubts about Joe Biden's handling of Israel and Gaza. All of that, I think, creates a real question mark about will the Democrats be able to launch a competitive, high turnout campaign? If not, the enthusiasm for Donald Trump may be enough to tip Minnesota into the Republican column for the first time since 1972.
Quickly, Robert Kennedy, F. Kennedy Jr., is on the ballot in Minnesota. There's not been a lot of discussion of that, but what kind of impact? Who is he going to try and pull votes from? There was a recent phone call between the two of them that was between Trump and Kennedy, where Trump was trying to get Kennedy to drop out of the race. But who does that help, both here in Minnesota and across the country?
It's really unclear the impact of Kennedy. Initially, Democrats were fearful because of the Kennedy name that he might draw more Democrats. But we have seen some polling data suggesting that Kennedy is also drawing the kind of populist, disaffected voter who doesn't like the establishment, whereas Trump is seen as more establishment after being president. So I think this is a big question mark as to whether Kennedy draws more from Joe Biden or from Donald Trump.
Well, listen, Larry Jacobs, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
Up next are Republican and Democratic Party analysts. Well, joining us right now are Democratic analyst Abou Amara. Abou, what next?
Yeah, I think right now we're in uncharted territory. I think from the Republican standpoint, they have, obviously Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt. Thank God he did. But that is kind of political rocket fuel. And so I think you're seeing a consolidation of the Republican Party much faster than I think people anticipated. And the Democratic Party, right now, we're still asking questions. Is Joe Biden going to be the nominee? Is he not going to be the nominee? And if he's not, who's it going to be? And so I think there's kind of been a 360, if you will. The Democrats were united about 6 months ago and the Republicans were divided. And I think it's starting to flip.
Let me ask you about the rocket fuel. Was Trump's response, which whatever you think of former President Trump, was extraordinary. The defiance, really, I think you have to say the courage in the face of being shot. Is that contributing to the rocket fuel? How much of an impression and what kind of impact does Trump's immediate reaction to the assassination attempt have?
Yeah, there's no question. Someone who disagrees with them on policy, but the optics, I mean, we're pretty powerful. I have to admit, I consider Donald Trump to be the TV producer in chief. He is someone who understands images, understands identity, and understands how to connect to an audience in a visceral way. And I think, being shot at and moments later being able to compose yourself in a way to then react the way he did, as someone who's not going to vote for him, I still have to admit that's a pretty strong and powerful message to send.
In terms of appealing to other groups, it's clear this convention is an effort by Republicans to appeal to people that have not ordinarily completely been in their camp. The first night, a complete appeal to Black voters, even having, influencer Amber Rose address the crowd, having Representative Byron Donald sitting right next to the injured President Trump. There's going to be an appeal to women with Nikki Haley. Is that going to work? Are people going to be tuning into this?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between effort and results. It's clear from the effort standpoint, the Republicans are targeting two groups of people, at least on the first night of the convention, and that were African-American men. And also they were targeting the blue wall. Remember, they had the president of the Teamsters Union, who has not attended a Republican convention in a century, at the Republican convention. So Donald Trump is attacking that blue wall. He's saying Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, I'm coming for you. And African-American men in the suburbs of Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, I am prioritizing you. Will it work? I don't think so. But you clearly see that the effort is there.
And clearly, and you mentioned the president of the Teamsters. That was extraordinary. I mean, he didn't exactly get a standing ovation But that is obviously a big thing. And of course, Joe Biden wants to be the president of labor. In terms of going back to the optics and the impact, to me, it just seems extraordinary that you have at this moment the image of Biden and the questions surrounding him about his strength and ability to go forward. And you have Donald Trump, who is virtually the same age, just 3 years younger, and these questions about him, an extraordinary juxtaposition. Also, you've got this very young, very J.D. Vance is somebody who doesn't toe the line, just like Donald Trump is. What do you think the impact is of that?
Yeah, so I think at first glance, JD Vance could, for many folks, represent a generational shift, right? A very much, the questions have been, can these two candidates actually serve another 4 years? And so I think the generational distinction for Trump on its face is a good one. The reality, though, is when folks get to know JD Vance, and remember, the vast majority of the country knows Donald Trump, the vast majority of the country knows Joe Biden. They do not know JD Vance. And JD Vance's record is going to be called into question. Things he said about abortion, things he said about women who are in domestic abuse situations. And so
Things he said about Donald Trump.
Even what he said
Harsh
about Donald Trump.
criticism of Donald Trump in 2016.
He said Donald Trump might be America's Hitler. Those are his words, not mine. And so it's going to be interesting. It gives Democrats a bit of a life raft, a bit of a person to really contrast around the issues that Democrats want to run on, including abortion. And so we'll see what happens as we move forward.
And quickly, Minnesota, are we a swing state now?
The answer is no, because the Democratic Party has infrastructure in the state. The Republican Party does not. That's going to be the difference in November.
All right, Abou Amara, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. We really appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us right now, Amy Koch, our Republican analyst. Thank you so much, Amy, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, your take on these extraordinary days in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on former President Trump.
It's stunning. Somehow, sort of, we've talked about this so many times, and I just keep repeating, never has an election seemed so inevitable, and also like anything could happen. And it continues to play out.
And when you say the inevitable, do you mean inevitable for President Trump, former President Trump?
From both sides, right? I think that last year when we were talking, as people were jumping into run, and would there be a significant challenge to President Biden, and would Nikki Haley or some other Republican make a run at former President Trump? But also it seemed like, well, it's going to come down to Biden and Trump. Well, how can it possibly come down to Biden and Trump? And it has, but in a way that feels so uncertain, right? Like, I think Saturday I was stunned, but also part of me went, oh, this is just how this cycle is going to go. Thank goodness he is okay. I can't even imagine, but there was a terrible loss of life. And I don't know that I sad to say, I don't feel like we've reached the end of that yet, this election cycle. I would hope we have. I would hope that this would be a ringing alarm bell for both candidates to take down the rhetoric, to have respectful conversations, and then get to November. But I don't know how much it's too little too late on that even.
What are you hearing from Minnesota Republicans in the aftermath of the assassination attempt?
So, a lot of surprise, a lot of admiration for former President Trump for, a near miss with a bullet, and standing up and walking off the stage sort of defiantly, right?
Yeah.
Some real, like it's hard to not see the leadership there. I don't know how I would say.
Remarkable, and that
What?
defiance, I think, whatever you think of the former president, whatever side you're on, it's a remarkable reaction to being shot. He was shot. He was in his ear, but he came within a millimeter of being killed.
Shot to the head. So I do think there's questions of like, what will this do to him as a candidate? If something like this doesn't sort of have an altering, and he's even already said, like, he's rewriting his speech for the convention, that he was going to have, a lot of like, these are what's so bad. And he feels that it's maybe not appropriate now, which is an interesting observation for the president. We'll see when he gives his speech. But there may be some freedom in what this has brought him. And will this have in 3 months be the thing that people are voting on? Maybe not, but it's impossible to ignore the momentum that is now the Trump campaign. Already it was, right? Going into the debate, he was gathering steam. The debate was a debacle for President Biden, no doubt about it. And then this happens within 2 days of the Republican convention. You couldn't write this. If you wrote this script, Ismay, they would tell us that, that's
No one
not
would believe it.
they would not believe it. It's too unbelievable. Take it back. But that is what's happened. So his campaign has been on this like upward trajectory. There's no other way to see it.
And the documents case being dismissed on top of all that, extraordinary. And that got overshadowed by all the headlines of the assassination attempt. Which
Right. Who would have thought that dismissal would have been like a sideline headline?
Right. Completely overshadowed.
More good news for the Trump campaign.
Yeah. What about the selection of J.D. Vance? What are you hearing from Republicans?
So a mixed, for me, I was kind of like, okay, I feel like that was like a safe choice, very loyal to the president, has been, although he was a very outspoken never Trumper for many years.
And those sound bites of him being a never Trumper are pretty strong back in 2016.
They are going to play. But, he's 39 years old. He's a millennial. I would just say, why do we go from boomers to millennials? What about Gen X? But that's just but he's young family, smart guy, Yale Law, pulled himself up. His story is remarkable, and he's certainly got some political chops, which will, I would guess, be added to the mix. But I think, and what I've heard is Donald Trump likes that he is so well-spoken and so articulate about issues. And I think he adds some energy. A Nikki Haley pick would have been like going completely against the grain and really a play for all those kind of disaffected Republican voters. But J.D. Vance is I think a safe play for the Trump campaign.
Overall, though, Donald Trump is on a roll. I don't mean to be disrespectful after what happened, but it seems things are certainly going his way.
They're on a roll, and I heard from his camp is that he was not intending to announce his VP pick this on Monday, that he decided himself that was going to happen. He decided who it was, and he was ready to announce it. And same thing with like speaking at the convention. There's a slot for him to speak, but at any minute they're being told like he might just decide to get up there and speak from his heart. So it's a little bit of it could be a little bit of a different candidate we're looking at. We'll see. We'll see. But there's certainly momentum behind this campaign.
All right. Amy Koch, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Coming up, constitutional law professor David Schultz on a headline that has gotten buried. A federal judge has dismissed the classified documents case against former President Trump. What's next? Well, joining us right now is political analyst and Hamlin constitutional law professor David Schultz. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Esme.
Before we get to the really stunning dismissal of the classified documents case, I just want to ask you your take on this extraordinary few days in which we have seen for the first time in 40 years a president or presidential candidate or former president nearly assassinated, this time missing by millimeters.
Yeah, I want to put this in perspective. I do a lot of talks to community groups and over the last few years, and groups always start off by saying to me, isn't it the most polarized we've been in American history? And I say, no, the 1960s were worse. 1968, a presidential candidate and a civil rights leader were assassinated. We're nowhere near that. I don't know if I can say that anymore, because what we've now looked at between January 6, 2021 and the attempted assassination on Donald Trump is really a period now of just such intense political anger and polarization. It's hard to figure out where we're going to head next at this point, but it clearly puts us among those worst points in American history in terms of how divided we are, especially when we look at the fact that since the assassination attempt, both sides are accusing one another of causing this attempted assassination.
Is former President Trump's response, which whatever you think of former President Trump, Is his response that occurred just in the seconds after he had been shot, is that response where he was clearly defiant, talking fight, fight, fight? Do you think that's going to help him?
It's certainly not going to hurt him. And one can read that response in several ways. One of them is just simply the response to his supporters that he's going to go on, he's going to be defiant. But some people might read it as saying that what? It's more of defiance against anybody who wants to challenge or destroy the American election system in terms of, we endure no matter what. But it'll be curious to see in the next few days what the polling is looking like. And if I put this in perspective, before the first debate, Biden and Trump were sort of neck and neck. Trump had a slight lead. The first debate was not good for Biden in terms of eroding his support. His efforts to try to rehabilitate himself at Stephanopoulos interview didn't help. Certainly, I think what happened with the attempted assassination puts the focus on Trump, and I think sets a contrast of a defiant Donald Trump overcoming whatever against a Joe Biden who still looks frail by comparison. So the contrasts are just multiple and work probably to Trump's advantage and Biden's disadvantage.
On any other week, the dismissal of the classified documents case in federal court against the former president would have been headlines for days. This was seen by a lot of legal analysts as the strongest case against the former president. What happens now? What is the impact of this?
Well, first off, if we looked at the existing constitutional law out there, the judge should have never dismissed the case. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld special prosecutors' laws and upheld the constitutionality of a special prosecutor nearly 40 years ago. I think the decision now for the Justice Department is where to go next. Do they appeal the decision, which is a possibility? Do they try to set up a different special prosecutor under a different circumstance, or do they walk away from the case? I don't think they're going to walk away. I suspect it's going to get appealed. Having said that, what that means now is that there's very little likelihood that this case is going to come to trial before the election. And for Democrats who, a year ago were hoping 4 different court trials, potentially 91 indictments, that was going to save their presidential hopeful. That's not going to happen at this point. And so look at this case in terms of what's going to happen to it on appeal, or again, if Trump does get elected, it's probably going to get dismissed.
All right. Well, Professor David Schultz, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Esme.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, feel free to email me at esme@cbs.com. The show streams every Wednesday and Thursday night at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Fridays, the show posts to YouTube for on-demand viewing. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.